The wind, sharp as a newly honed blade, whips dust and stray strands of her hair across Sarah Miller's face, but she doesn't flinch. Her gaze is fixed, unwavering, on the crude wooden platform erected in the center of Redemption Gulch's main thoroughfare. An auction is underway, not of livestock or foreclosed properties, but of human misfortune. The auctioneer, a portly man named Silas Croft with a voice like gravel in a tin can, bellows, his words rolling over the grim-faced assembly. "All right, folks, what am I bid for this sorry specimen? Strong back, or so he claims, though a bit lacking in the seeing department. Comes with baggage, mind you, a little chit of a girl." Sarah's gloved hands clench at her sides, the worn leather cool against her skin despite the tension coiling in her belly, a sensation distinct from the gentle stirrings of the child she carries. She sees him then, the man on the block, tall, lean to the point of gauntness, with a ragged patch covering his left eye. His remaining eye, a startling blue, scans the crowd with a look that's not quite defiance, not quite despair, but a weary resignation that chills her to the bone. Clinging to his leg, half hidden by his threadbare coat, is a small girl, no more than 5 or 6, her face pale, her dark hair tangled. She doesn't cry, just stares with wide, frightened eyes, a miniature echo of her father's stoicism. A man and his whelp, sold for debt. Croft continues, seeking a bid. Good for mucking stalls, chopping wood. Someone start the bidding. $10? $5. A jeer comes from the back. He's damaged goods, Croft. And who wants another mouth to feed? Especially a half-blind one's get. Before we ride deeper into this Western tale, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. And if you love a good old-fashioned story of the frontier, hit like and subscribe. Sarah feels a knot tighten in her chest. She knows desperation. It's been her constant companion for months. Ever since word of her condition, her unmarried state, had followed her from the east like a persistent shadow. She'd come to Redemption Gulch seeking anonymity, a place to have her child in peace, armed with a small, dwindling inheritance and a fierce will to survive. She had not expected this public degradation, this parading of human souls as chattel. The little girl's silent terror mirrors her own hidden fears for her unborn baby. The man's stoic suffering resonates with a lifetime of her own quiet battles. The stakes are clear. These two souls face separation, or worse, a cruel master. Her own future is uncertain, perilous. But in this moment, another's peril eclipses her own. $2! Someone finally calls out, a rough-looking man with greedy eyes fixed on the cowboy. For the man, the girl you can keep, Croft, or send to the orphanage. The cowboy flinches, his one visible hand tightening protectively on the child's shoulder. Sarah sees the raw anguish in that single movement. She's not a wealthy woman. Every cent she possesses is earmarked for her survival and her baby's. But something within her, a core of outrage and an unexpected surge of empathy, refuses to let this pass. Her decision is made in the space of a heartbeat, reckless and absolute. Her voice, though not loud, cuts through the murmuring. $20. A hush falls over the crowd. Heads turn. Whispers erupt like dry leaves skittering in the wind. Who said that? The new woman, the pregnant one. Croft's eyes, small and assessing, find her. He's surprised. Then a smirk plays on his lips. $20 from the lady in the blue bonnet. A generous bid. A sporting bid. Do I hear 25? He scans the crowd. The greedy man scoffs and shakes his head. No one else speaks. The townsfolk are more interested in the spectacle of a pregnant, solitary woman bidding on a one-eyed man and his child. $20 going once, Croft intones, his eyes still on Sarah. Going twice, he pauses, milking the moment. The cowboy turns his head slowly, his single blue eye finding hers. It's a look of disbelief, questioning, a flicker of something she can't name. Hope, perhaps, or merely profound surprise. Lily peeks out from behind her father's leg, her gaze following his. Sold. Croft bangs his gavel on the makeshift podium. To the kind lady in the blue bonnet, for $20. The one-eyed cowboy and his girl. And with those words, Sarah Miller, Jedediah Thorne, and little Lily Thorne were bound together by a desperate act of compassion. A transaction that would send ripples of astonishment and speculation through the unforgiving heart of the frontier. The journey from the auction block to Sarah's small, isolated cabin on the outskirts of Redemption Gulch was made in a silence thick with unspoken questions and simmering anxieties. Jedediah Thorne walked beside her, his gait stiff, his one good eye fixed on the dusty path ahead. Little Lily, her initial terror having subsided into a wary quietness, held tightly to his hand, occasionally casting furtive glances at Sarah, then quickly looking away if their eyes met. Sarah herself felt a tremor of apprehension. The $20 had been a significant portion of her remaining funds, a gamble made on instinct rather than logic. Now, the reality of her impulsive purchase settled upon her like the weight of the late afternoon sun. Her cabin was modest, to put it kindly. 2 small rooms, built of rough-hewn timber, with a stone chimney that leaned precariously. A patch of neglected land surrounded it, choked with weeds and stubborn prairie grass. It was a stark contrast to the comfortable homes she'd known back east, before her life had taken its sharp, unexpected turn. She'd bought it cheap, its previous owner having succumbed to lung fever the winter before. It was isolated, which had been its primary appeal. Now that isolation felt both a blessing and a curse. "This is it," Sarah said, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet air. She pushed open the creaky door. The interior was sparse. A small cast-iron stove, a rough wooden table with 2 mismatched chairs, a narrow cot in one corner, and a slightly larger, though equally rudimentary, bed in the other, which was hers. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and old dust. Jedediah surveyed the room, his expression unreadable. Lily pressed closer to him. Sarah felt a flush creep up her neck. It wasn't much to offer, certainly not a place of comfort or security for a man and his child who had just been sold like property. "The girl can sleep on the cot," Sarah said, trying to sound practical, businesslike. You can take the floor by the stove. I have an extra blanket." It was a clumsy arrangement, born of necessity. She was acutely aware of the impropriety, of the whispers that would inevitably follow her back to town. Mrs. Griselda Higgins, the town's self-appointed moral guardian and chief disseminator of gossip, would have a field day. Sarah had seen her beady eyes fixed on them as they left the auction, a look of smug condemnation already forming on her pinched face. That scornful gaze was a subtle, yet potent, reminder of the societal judgment that loomed over them. Jedediah finally spoke, his voice low and raspy, as if from disuse. "Ma'am, we're grateful for not separating us." His gaze flickered towards Lily, a deep, aching tenderness in that single blue eye. "No child should be separated from their parent if it can be helped," Sarah replied, her tone softer than she intended. She remembered her own lonely childhood, shuffled between indifferent relatives after her parents died. The memory was a constant, dull ache. "There's stew from yesterday. Not much, but it's warm." She busied herself at the stove, adding a little water to the pot, acutely aware of Jedediah's presence. He was a large man, and the small cabin seemed to shrink around him. He moved with a careful economy, as if wary of disturbing the fragile peace. Lily, seeing her father remain calm, ventured a few steps away from him, her eyes wide as she took in the strange new surroundings. The stew was, as Sarah had said, not much, but they ate it in a companionable silence, broken only by Lily's occasional soft murmurings. Afterwards, Jedediah took the offered blanket without a word and settled Lily onto the cot, tucking the worn fabric around her with surprising gentleness. He then lay down on the floor near the still warm stove, his back to Sarah. Sleep did not come easily to Sarah that night. Her mind raced with the implications of her actions. She had bought a man, a stranger, and his child. She, a woman alone, pregnant, already an object of scrutiny. What had she been thinking? Yet, when she recalled the look in Lily's eyes, the quiet despair in Jedediah's stance on that auction block, a sense of rightness, however precarious, settled over her. This was not about ownership. It was about offering a sliver of sanctuary in a brutal world. The next morning, Sarah awoke to the smell of wood smoke. Jedediah was already up, tending a small fire he'd built in the stove. He'd found her woodpile, meager as it was, and the kindling. He nodded a curt greeting when she emerged from behind the blanket she'd hung for privacy. "There's a stream nearby," he said, his voice still gravelly. "Fetched some fresh water," he indicated a bucket, fuller than she usually managed to haul herself. Sarah felt a flicker of surprise, then gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne." "Jedediah." "Or Jed," he corrected quietly. "And thank you, ma'am, for Lily." "Sarah," she replied. "My name is Sarah." An understanding, fragile and unspoken, seemed to pass between them. This was not a master-servant relationship, at least not in the conventional sense. It was an arrangement born of her desperate compassion and his desperate need. The first few days established a quiet routine. Jedediah, despite his missing eye, proved to be remarkably capable. He had a woodsman's skill, assessing the deadfall around the property, his axe swinging with a steady, practiced rhythm. He repaired the loose shutter on the window, mended a section of the rickety fence around the weed-choked garden patch, and even managed to coax a sputtering life back into the old water pump that Sarah had given up on. He worked without complaint, from dawn till dusk, his movements economical, his energy seemingly boundless despite his lean frame. He spoke little, mostly in quiet responses to Sarah's questions or in soft reassurances to Lily. Lily, after the initial shock, began to explore her new surroundings with a child's cautious curiosity. She was a solemn little thing, her smiles rare but precious. She followed her father like a shadow, her small hands often reaching for his. Sarah, observing them, saw a bond of profound love and reliance. Jedediah, for all his outward gruffness, was infinitely tender with his daughter. He would carve her little figures from scraps of wood in the evenings. His one good eye focused intently, his large, calloused hands surprisingly deft. He told her stories in a low murmur, tales of mischievous squirrels and brave little rabbits, his voice losing its harsh edge, becoming almost melodic. Sarah found herself watching them, a strange ache in her heart. It was a glimpse of a family life she had never known, and one she feared she might never have for her own child. Her own past was a tapestry of loss and disappointment. Her parents gone too soon. A brief, ill-fated romance with a charming man who had promised her the world and then vanished when he learned of her pregnancy, leaving her to face the shame and the uncertain future alone. She had come west to escape the pointing fingers, the whispers, the suffocating judgment of her small eastern town. She had sought solitude, but now, unexpectedly, she had company. The arrangement was, by its very nature, awkward. Sharing such a small space with a strange man, even one as quiet and respectful as Jedediah, was a constant negotiation of boundaries. Sarah was acutely aware of his presence, of the subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere when he was near. She found herself noticing the way the sunlight caught the weathered lines on his face, the strength in his shoulders as he chopped wood, the rare moments when a hint of a smile touched his lips, usually prompted by something Lily said or did. One afternoon, Sarah was attempting to weed the stubborn patch of earth she hoped to turn into a vegetable garden. The work was harder than she anticipated, her growing belly making bending difficult. She felt a wave of dizziness and straightened up, pressing a hand to her back. Jedediah, who had been mending a harness nearby, approached her. "Best you sit, Sarah," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "This ain't work for your condition." Before she could protest, he took the hoe from her hand. "Show me what needs doing. I've a hand for growing things." And he did. Over the next few days, he transformed the neglected patch, his strong hands turning the soil, clearing the stubborn roots, his knowledge of planting and tending far exceeding hers. He worked with a quiet efficiency, never complaining about the poor quality of the soil or the lack of proper tools. Sarah watched, a mixture of gratitude and a strange, unfamiliar sense of being cared for stirring within her. Their first real test from the outside world came a week later, during Sarah's necessary trip into Redemption Gulch for supplies. She had hoped to go alone, to spare Jedediah the inevitable stares and comments, but he had insisted on accompanying her. "Not safe for you to go alone," he'd said, his one blue eye firm. "And Lily needs a bit of air that ain't just this cabin." The town received them with a mixture of avid curiosity and outright hostility. As they walked down the main street, conversations ceased, heads turned, and whispers followed them like a swarm of persistent insects. Sarah felt her cheeks burn, but she held her head high, her hand resting protectively on her belly. Jedediah walked beside her, Lily's small hand in his gaze straight ahead, seemingly oblivious to the scrutiny. But Sarah saw the tightening of his jaw, the subtle tension in his shoulders. At the general store, Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, a man usually given to jovial greetings, was coolly polite, his eyes darting from Sarah to Jedediah and back again. As Sarah paid for her meager purchases, flour, salt, a little sugar, Mrs. Griselda Higgins, who seemed to materialize wherever gossip was brewing, cornered her near the counter. "Well, Sarah Miller," Mrs. Higgins began, her voice dripping with sanctimonious disapproval, her eyes like chips of flint. "Quite the stir you've caused. Buying a man, and a damaged one at that. And you in your condition." She cast a pointed look at Sarah's swollen abdomen. "It's hardly proper. What kind of example are you setting?" Sarah felt a surge of anger, but she kept her voice even. "Mr. Thorne and his daughter needed help, Mrs. Higgins. I offered it. It's no one's concern but my own." "Humph. Charity is one thing, Miss Miller," Mrs. Higgins sniffed. "But this arrangement, it's an offense to decent folk. A woman alone, taking in a strange man. People are talking." "Let them talk," Sarah said, her patience wearing thin. Jedediah, who had been standing silently by the door with Lily, stepped forward. His voice, though quiet, carried an unexpected authority. "Mrs. Higgins, ma'am. Miss Miller showed us kindness when no one else would. We ain't looking for trouble, just a chance to live peaceable." Mrs. Higgins looked taken aback by Jedediah's direct address. She gave him a withering glare, then turned on her heel and swept out of the store, muttering about the decline of moral standards on the frontier. Mr. Henderson, who had witnessed the exchange, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Folks round here are traditional, Miss Miller," he said, by way of a half-hearted apology. "I'm aware of that, Mr. Henderson," Sarah replied, gathering her purchases. The walk back to the cabin was subdued. The encounter had cast a pall over them, a stark reminder of their precarious position. Sarah felt a renewed sense of anxiety. What if the town decided to interfere? What if they tried to take Lily away from Jedediah, or force him to leave? That evening, as Lily slept soundly on her cot, Sarah found herself speaking of her fears to Jedediah. "They won't leave us be, will they?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Mrs. Higgins. She speaks for many of them." Jedediah was silent for a long moment, staring into the dying embers of the fire. "Some folks," he said finally, his voice low, "can't abide anything that ain't square in their own narrow view of the world. They see a bent tree, they want to chop it down, not wonder how it grew that way." He looked at her then, his one eye earnest. But we ain't done nothing wrong, Sarah. You showed compassion. I'm workin' for my keep, and for Lily's. But it's not enough for them, Sarah said, a note of despair creeping into her voice. They see something else. Something shameful. What they see is their own small minds reflected back at them, Jedediah said, a surprising fierceness in his tone. Don't you let them make you feel ashamed, Sarah. You did a good thing. A brave thing. His words, simple and direct, were a balm to her frayed nerves. She looked at him, at the quiet strength in his face, the unwavering loyalty in his eye. He was a man who had known hardship, who had been stripped of his dignity. Yet he possessed an integrity that shamed the self-righteousness of people like Mrs. Higgins. "Thank you, Jed," she said softly. A comfortable silence settled between them, the kind that speaks of shared understanding. In the flickering firelight, the small cabin felt less like a place of forced cohabitation and more like a fragile sanctuary, a tiny bastion against the harsh judgments of the outside world. Sarah realized, with a jolt of surprise, that she no longer felt entirely alone. She had an ally, an unexpected partner in this struggle for survival and acceptance. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm of shared labor and quiet coexistence. Jedediah continued to transform the small homestead. He cleared more land, his axe a steady beat against the silence of the prairie. He repaired the leaky roof of the small lean-to shed, turning it into a more secure shelter for the few tools Sarah possessed, and eventually, he hoped, for a milking goat or some chickens, if their fortunes ever allowed for such luxuries. He had a knack for making do, for coaxing utility out of the most unpromising materials. He fashioned a sturdier latch for the cabin door from a piece of scrap metal and a length of cured leather. He even managed to rig a surprisingly effective irrigation system for the burgeoning vegetable garden, using a series of shallow trenches to channel water from the nearby stream. Sarah, her energy levels fluctuating with the progression of her pregnancy, focused on domestic tasks. She mended their clothes, her needle moving with a practiced skill. She learned to bake a passable, if somewhat heavy, bread in the temperamental oven of the cast-iron stove. She read to Lily in the evenings from the one dog-eared book of fairy tales she possessed, her voice soft and soothing. Lily, who had initially been shy and withdrawn, began to blossom under the gentle, consistent attention. She would follow Sarah around the cabin, chattering about the wildflowers she'd picked or the funny-shaped cloud she'd seen. She even started to call her Sarah, her childish pronunciation making the name sound like a sweet melody. The bond between Jedediah and Lily remained the anchor of their small world. Sarah often watched them together, marveling at the depth of their connection. Jedediah might have lost an eye and his worldly possessions, but his love for his daughter was a fierce, unyielding force. He taught her how to identify bird calls, how to track rabbits by their prints in the soft earth, how to skip stones across the surface of the stream. His patience with her was infinite, and Lily, in turn, adored him, her trust in him absolute. One evening, as Sarah sat mending one of Jedediah's worn shirts, Lily climbed onto her lap, a rare gesture of spontaneous affection. "Sarah?" she whispered, her small hand patting Sarah's rounded belly. "Is the baby sleeping?" Sarah smiled, her heart warming. "Yes, I think so, sweetling. When the baby comes, can I teach it to sing like the meadowlark?" Lily asked, her eyes shining with earnestness. "I think the baby would like that very much," Sarah replied, her voice thick with emotion. She hugged Lily close, breathing in the scent of sunshine and wood smoke that clung to the child's hair. In that moment, the cabin felt full, not with possessions, but with a quiet, burgeoning sense of family. But the outside world, with its judgments and suspicions, was never far away. Their next encounter with the town's disapproval came in the form of Sheriff Brody. He was a man of medium build, with a weary face and eyes that had seen too much of the frontier's harsh realities. He rode out to the cabin one sweltering afternoon, his badge glinting in the sun. "Miss Miller," he said, dismounting, his gaze taking in Jedediah, who stood silently by the woodpile, axe in hand, and Lily, who peeked out from behind Sarah's skirts. "Got some concerns raised about your living arrangements here." "Concerns, Sheriff?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Folks are talkin'," Brody said, shifting uncomfortably. "A single woman, pregnant, livin' with a man who ain't her husband, and him bein', well, bought at auction. It ain't sittin' right with some." He glanced at Jedediah. "No offense intended, Thorne." Jedediah just nodded, his expression impassive, but Sarah saw the muscle twitch in his jaw. "Mr. Thorne works for me, Sheriff," Sarah stated, her chin lifting. "He and his daughter had nowhere else to go. I offered them shelter and honest work in exchange for their keep. There is nothing improper about it." "Maybe not in your eyes, Miss Miller," Brody said, his gaze returning to her. "But this is a small community. Reputations matter. And there's the matter of the child, Lily. Some are saying she'd be better off in an orphanage, or with a proper family." A cold dread washed over Sarah. The thought of Lily being taken from Jedediah was unbearable. "Lily is well cared for, Sheriff," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to remain calm. "Her father loves her dearly. You can see for yourself. She's a happy child." Brody looked at Lily, who clutched Sarah's skirt, her eyes wide with apprehension. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, Miss Miller, I ain't here to cause trouble, but the town council's been approached. Mrs. Higgins mostly and a few others. They're talking about intervention." "Intervention." Jedediah finally spoke, his voice dangerously low. "What kind of intervention?" "They want to discuss the moral welfare of the child, Thorne," Brody said, his tone hardening slightly, "and the propriety of this whole setup. There's talk of calling a town meeting." Sarah felt her blood run cold. A town meeting, a public trial, essentially. Her private life, her desperate attempt to build some semblance of security, all to be picked apart by strangers. "We ain't done nothin' to warrant a town meeting, Sheriff," Jedediah said, taking a step forward. "We keep to ourselves. We bother no one inch." "It ain't always about what you've done, Thorne," Brody said, his gaze steady. "Sometimes it's about how things look. And right now, to a lot of folks in Redemption Gulch, this don't look right." He tipped his hat to Sarah. "Just thought I'd give you fair warning. Expect to hear something official soon with that." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Sarah sank onto the rough bench outside the cabin door, her legs suddenly weak. Jedediah stood over her, his face grim. Lily, sensing the tension, began to cry softly. "They can't take her, Jed," Sarah whispered, reaching for Lily, pulling the child into her lap. "They can't." Jedediah knelt beside them, his one good eye filled with a fierce, protective light. "No, Sarah," he said, his voice a low growl. "They won't. I won't let them." But how could they stop it? They were outsiders, vulnerable, their arrangement an affront to the town's sensibilities. The threat of the town meeting loomed over them, a dark cloud on the horizon. Sarah felt a familiar despair begin to creep in, the kind that had haunted her for months. But then she looked at Jedediah's determined face, felt Lily's small arms around her neck, and a different feeling began to take root. A stubborn, defiant anger. She had not come this far, endured so much, only to have her fragile peace shattered by prejudice and gossip. As the days passed, the unspoken tension in the cabin grew. The threat of the town council's intervention hung over them, poisoning the small moments of peace they had managed to carve out. Jedediah worked with a grim intensity, his axe strokes harder, his silences longer. Sarah found it difficult to concentrate on her chores, her mind constantly replaying Sheriff Brody's warning. Lily, sensitive to the adult's anxiety, became quieter, her laughter less frequent. One evening, as a storm gathered on the horizon, mirroring the turmoil in their lives, Sarah found Jedediah staring out the small window, his gaze fixed on the darkening prairie. The wind howled around the corners of the cabin, rattling the shutters. "What are we going to do, Jed?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible above the rising wind. He turned, his face etched with worry in the dim light of the single flickering candle. "I've been thinking," he said slowly. "There's a man, Silas Blackwood. He's the one who claimed I owed him a debt I couldn't pay. A false debt. He's a powerful man, got connections. He's the reason Lily and I ended up on that auction block." Sarah listened, her heart sinking. Powerful enemy. Another complication they didn't need. "You think he's behind this? The town council?" Jedediah shook his head. "Not directly, maybe. Blackwood wouldn't dirty his own hands with town gossip. But he put the word out that I was no good, a drifter, unreliable. Made it easier for folks to believe the worst. If he hears I found a place," he hesitated, "he might try to make trouble. He didn't like me standing up to him when he tried to cheat me out of my wages." So, there was more to Jedediah's past than just misfortune. There was injustice, and a man who bore him ill will. This deepened the stakes considerably. It wasn't just vague societal disapproval they faced, but potentially a more malicious, targeted threat. "We can't just wait for them to decide our fate, Jed," Sarah said, a new resolve hardening her voice. "We have to do something." "What can we do, Sarah?" he asked, his voice raw with frustration. "I'm a one-eyed man bought at auction. Well, you know how they see you. We ain't got many friends in this town." "Maybe we don't need friends," Sarah said, though a part of her quailed at the thought of facing the town alone. "Maybe we just need to tell the truth, to stand up for ourselves." A particularly violent gust of wind slammed against the cabin, and the candle guttered, plunging them into near darkness. Lily whimpered in her sleep. Jedediah quickly moved to relight the candle, his large frame a reassuring presence in the shadowy room. "Standing up for myself ain't always worked out too well for me, Sarah," he said quietly, his face illuminated by the newly steady flame. "Lost my proving I wasn't a cheat in a card game. Lost my freedom trying to get fair pay from Blackwood." Sarah reached out, her hand resting briefly on his arm. His muscles were tense beneath the worn fabric of his shirt. "This time is different, Jed," she said softly. "You're not alone. And it's not just about you. It's about Lily. It's about us." The word hung in the air between them, fraught with unspoken meaning. A fragile, unconventional unit, bound together by circumstance and a growing, mutual reliance. There's one thing that might give us some stand-in," Jedediah said, his voice hesitant, his gaze avoiding hers. "Something that might make them see us differently. Or at least, make it harder for them to interfere." Sarah waited, a sense of foreboding mixed with a strange anticipation. "If we were married," he said, the words coming out in a rush. He finally looked at her, his one blue eye searching her face, apprehensive. "A marriage of convenience, Sarah, to protect Lily, to give you respectability. So they can't say you're living in sin, or that I'm just some hired hand you took in out of pity." Sarah stared at him, stunned into silence. Marriage. The thought had never crossed her mind. Marriage to Jedediah Thorne, the one-eyed cowboy she had bought at auction. It was a drastic, almost unthinkable solution. Yet, as the initial shock wore off, a strange sort of logic began to emerge. It would legitimize their household. It would give Jedediah parental rights that couldn't be easily challenged. It would shield her, to some extent, from the town's scorn. It wouldn't have to be a real marriage, Jedediah continued quickly, as if sensing her hesitation. Not in the usual way, just on paper, for appearances, For protection, Sarah thought of her unborn child. What kind of future would it have, born to an unmarried mother, in a town so quick to judge? What if they tried to take her baby too? The fear was a cold, sharp thing. Would it work, Jed? She asked, her voice small. Would they accept it? It'd be harder for them to argue against a married couple, he said. The preacher, Reverend Miles, he might be persuaded to perform the ceremony, if we explain the circumstances. He seems a fair man, mostly. More worried about souls than town gossip, I reckon. Sarah looked around the small, rough cabin. It was a far cry from the life she had once envisioned for herself. But it was a home of sorts, and Jedediah, with his quiet strength and unwavering loyalty to Lily, was a good man, a decent man, despite the hardships he had endured. He was offering her a shield, a way to protect not just Lily, but herself and her unborn child. All right, Jed, she said, her decision made with a sudden clarity that surprised her. Let's do it. Let's get married. A look of profound relief washed over Jedediah's face, so potent it was almost painful to witness. Thank you, Sarah, he whispered. You won't regret this. Sarah wasn't so sure about that. Regret was a luxury she couldn't afford. This was about survival, about protecting the small, fragile family they had become. The storm outside raged on, but within the cabin, a decision had been made, a new path chosen. They would face the town not as outcasts, but as a family, bound by law, if not yet by love. The following morning, the storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean and the earth smelling fresh and damp. Sarah and Jedediah, their decision solidified in the cool light of day, prepared to approach Reverend Miles. Lily, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, a new determination in her father and Sarah, was quiet but watchful. Reverend Miles was a thin, scholarly man with kind eyes and a thoughtful demeanor. His small church, a simple wooden structure with a modest steeple, stood at the edge of town, a little removed from the hustle and bustle of the main street. He listened patiently as Sarah and Jedediah, in halting, earnest tones, explained their situation and their request. Jedediah spoke of his fears for Lily, of the threat of the town council's intervention. Sarah spoke of her desire for stability, for a way to protect her household and her unborn child from malicious gossip and interference. They were careful to frame their request as a practical necessity, a shield against societal judgment, rather than a matter of romantic affection. The Reverend stroked his chin, his gaze moving between them. This is an unconventional proposal, he said finally. Marriage is a sacred vow, not merely a legal convenience. We understand that, Reverend, Sarah said, her voice sincere, and we would not enter into it lightly, but our circumstances are unique. We believe this is the best way to protect an innocent child and to live peaceably in this community. Jedediah added, we aim to build a decent life here, Reverend. Family. This would give us the chance to do that, without folks looking down their noses or trying to tear us apart. Reverend Miles was silent for a long moment, his gaze thoughtful. He had seen the way Mrs. Higgins and her cronies operated, the way they could whip up a storm of moral outrage over the smallest deviation from their perceived norms. He had also seen the quiet dignity of Sarah Miller, her courage in the face of adversity. And he had heard whispers of Jedediah Thorne's skill and hard work, his devotion to his daughter. The good Lord looks upon the heart, not just the outward appearance, the Reverend said slowly. And he has a particular fondness for the fatherless and the widow, or in your case, Miss Miller, the woman standing alone. If this union is entered into with respect, and with the primary aim of protecting the innocent and creating a stable home, then I see no spiritual impediment, he sighed. It will undoubtedly cause more talk, at least initially, but perhaps, in time, it will silence the more malicious tongues. He agreed to perform the ceremony the following afternoon, quietly in the church, with only a witness required, perhaps Mr. Henderson from the general store, if he was willing. Relief washed over Sarah and Jedediah. It was a significant hurdle overcome. As they left the church, the sun felt warmer, the future a little less daunting. They stopped at Henderson's mercantile to ask him to be their witness. Mr. Henderson, a man more inclined to kindness than to gossip when it came down to it, listened to their request with a surprised but not unsympathetic expression. After a moment's thought, he agreed. "Reckon a man's got a right to try and make a life for himself and his child," he said, nodding at Jedediah. "And a woman needs protection in these parts." His agreement was another small victory. The news of the impending marriage spread through Redemption Gulch like wildfire, fanned by the ever-vigilant Mrs. Higgins, who had somehow gotten wind of their visit to the Reverend. The reactions were mixed. Some, like Mrs. Higgins, were scandalized, seeing it as a desperate, unseemly attempt to legitimize an already improper situation. Others were merely curious, eager for a new topic of gossip. A few, a very few, were quietly supportive, admiring Sarah's courage or Jedediah's determination. The ceremony itself was brief and simple. Sarah wore her best, though still modest, dress, a faded calico. Jedediah had scrubbed himself clean and wore his least threadbare shirt. Lily, dressed in a clean, mended frock, stood between them, holding both their hands, her small face serious. Mr. Henderson stood awkwardly by, looking uncomfortable but resolute. Reverend Miles spoke the familiar words, his voice gentle but firm. When it came time for the vows, Sarah and Jedediah spoke them quietly, their eyes meeting briefly. There was no pretense of romantic love in their exchange, but there was a solemnity, a sense of shared purpose, of two people binding themselves together against a harsh world. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, a strange quietness fell over the small church. As they stepped out into the afternoon sun, legally bound, Mr. Henderson shook Jedediah's hand gruffly. "Wish you well, Thorne." "You too, Mrs. Thorne," he added with a nod to Sarah. The new title sounded foreign, almost shocking to Sarah's ears. Mrs. Thorne. She was no longer Sarah Miller, the solitary pregnant woman. She was Jedediah Thorne's wife. Their return to the cabin was quiet. The legal document, signed and witnessed, changed everything and nothing. They were still two near strangers, sharing a small space, bound by necessity. But now there was a new layer to their relationship, a public declaration that they were a unit, a family. That night, the awkwardness was palpable. There was only one proper bed in the cabin. Jedediah, true to his word that this was a marriage of convenience, laid his blanket on the floor by the stove, as he always had. But Sarah found herself unable to sleep. She lay in the bed, listening to his quiet breathing, acutely aware of his presence, of the vows they had taken. "Jed?" she whispered into the darkness. "Aye, Sarah?" His voice came low and steady. "Thank you," she said, for doing this. For Lily. For me." "No need for thanks, Sarah," he replied. "We're in this together now. For better or worse," as the Reverend said. His words, echoing the vows, resonated in the quiet cabin. For better or worse. They had faced judgment and condemnation. Now they had to build something that could withstand it. Their marriage might have been born of necessity, but Sarah felt a flicker of something else, something deeper than gratitude. It was respect, and perhaps the fragile beginnings of a different kind of bond. The immediate aftermath of the wedding was a flurry of renewed gossip in Redemption Gulch. Mrs. Higgins declared it a shameless mockery of a sacred institution. But even her pronouncements began to lose some of their venom. A marriage, however unconventional its origins, was still a marriage. It conferred a certain legitimacy, a societal framework that was harder to criticize openly. Sheriff Brody, when he next encountered Sarah in town, tipped his hat and addressed her as Mrs. Thorne with a measure of grudging respect. The overt threat of the town council's intervention seemed to recede, at least for the time being. Life at the cabin continued, but with subtle shifts. The shared surname created a new, unspoken intimacy. Jedediah, though still reserved, seemed to carry himself with a little more ease, a little less of the haunted look in his eye. He was no longer just the bought man. He was a husband, the head of a household, at least in the eyes of the law and the community. Sarah, in turn, found a strange comfort in the new title. Mrs. Thorne, it felt like a shield, a buffer against the harshness of the world. They still maintained their separate sleeping arrangements, Jedediah on the floor, Sarah in the bed. But the evenings felt different. They would sit by the fire, Lily asleep on her cot, and sometimes they would talk. Not about deep, personal matters, not yet, but about the day's work, about Lily's latest discoveries, about plans for the small homestead. Jedediah, Sarah discovered, had a dry, understated sense of humor that occasionally peeked through his reserve. He told her stories of his life before things went wrong, of working cattle drives, of the vast open prairies, of the camaraderie of the trail. He never spoke of Lily's mother, and Sarah never asked, sensing it was a wound too deep to touch. Sarah, in turn, found herself sharing small pieces of her own past, her quiet life in the East, her love of books, her dreams of a small cottage with a garden, dreams that had been shattered by betrayal and circumstance. She spoke of her anxieties about the coming baby, her fears of childbirth, of being a good mother. Jedediah listened patiently, his one eye fixed on her face, offering quiet words of reassurance. "You'll be a fine mother, Sarah," he said one evening, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You've got a good heart. Lily knows it. The baby will too." His simple words of encouragement meant more to her than she could say. She was beginning to rely on his quiet strength, his steadfast presence. He was becoming more than just a protector. He was becoming a confidant, a partner. One day, a new threat emerged, not from the town, but from Jedediah's past. A rider appeared at the edge of their property, a burly, unpleasant-looking man with cold eyes. Sarah, who was tending the garden, her belly now significantly rounder, felt a prickle of alarm. Jedediah, who had been chopping wood nearby, straightened up, his hand resting on the handle of his axe. "Thorne," the man called out, his voice a sneer. "Heard you landed on your feet. Or rather, got yourself bought by a desperate woman." Jedediah moved to stand in front of Sarah, shielding her. "What do you want, Cletus?" His voice was low and dangerous. "Silas Blackwood sends his regards," Cletus said, a malicious grin spreading across his face. "Heard you got yourself hitched. Figured he'd send a little wedding present. A reminder, like, you still owe him, Thorne. And he always collects his debts." "I owe Blackwood nothing," Jedediah said, his voice tight with anger. "He cheated me, and he knows it." "Blackwood don't see it that way," Cletus said, his eyes lingering on Sarah's pregnant form with an insolent stare that made her skin crawl. "He figures that since you're now a man of property, sort of," he gestured vaguely towards the cabin, "you might be in a better position to pay up. Or maybe your new missus has some funds tucked away. You tell Blackwood to stay away from me and my family," Jedediah growled, taking a step forward. The axe in his hand looked less like a tool and more like a weapon. Cletus's grin faltered slightly at Jedediah's menacing tone. "Just delivering a message, Thorne," he said, backing his horse up a few paces. "Blackwood ain't a patient man. He'll be seeing you," with a final, lingering look at Sarah. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy sense of foreboding. Sarah's hand flew to her belly, a protective gesture. "Jed, who is this Blackwood? What does he want?" Jedediah's face was grim, his one eye dark with anger and a weary resignation. "Silas Blackwood is a rancher, a wealthy one, over in the next county. I worked for him for a season. He accused me of stealing cattle, a lie. Tried to withhold my wages. When I stood up to him, he had his men beat me, then trumped up a debt, saying I owed him for lost stock and damages. That's how I ended up on Croft's auction block. He wanted to make an example of me, to break me. But the debt isn't real, Sarah said, horrified. Real enough in his eyes, Jedediah said bitterly. And he's got the power to make others believe it. He's a cruel, vindictive man, Sarah. He won't let this go. Especially now that he thinks I might have something he can take. His gaze flickered to her. Then to Lily, who had come to the cabin door, her face pale with fear, having overheard some of the exchange. The fragile peace they had built felt suddenly shattered. The threat from Blackwood was far more dangerous than the gossip of Redemption Gulch. This was a man who had already ruined Jedediah once and seemed intent on doing so again. That night, sleep was impossible. The cabin, usually a sanctuary, felt exposed, vulnerable. Sarah lay awake, listening to the crickets, her mind racing. They had to face this. Running wasn't an option, not with her so close to her time, and where would they go? Blackwood sounded like the kind of man who would pursue them relentlessly. Jed, she whispered again in the darkness. We can't let him intimidate us. He's not like Mrs. Higgins, Sarah. Jedediah's voice was heavy with weariness. He plays for keeps. He has men, guns. What can we do against that? We have the truth on our side, Sarah said, though her words sounded hollow even to her own ears. And we have each other, she paused, then added. Maybe Sheriff Brody could help. If Blackwood is breaking the law, threatening us. Jedediah snorted. A harsh, humorless sound. Brody? He's one sheriff in a big territory. Blackwood has money, influence. Brody might try, but his hands would likely be tied. Blackwood's clever. He'll make it look legal, or he'll send men like Cletus to do his dirty work. Men he can deny any connection to. A chilling thought occurred to Sarah. What if he tries to claim you again, as his property to settle the false debt? The silence from Jedediah's side of the room was answer enough. It was a real, terrifying possibility. Their marriage might protect them from town gossip, but would it stand against a ruthless man like Blackwood, who clearly believed he owned Jedediah? As the days turned into another week, the shadow of Silas Blackwood loomed large. Every distant rider, every unexpected sound, sent a jolt of anxiety through Sarah. Jedediah became even more watchful, rarely letting Sarah or Lily out of his sight when they were outside the cabin. He started carrying his axe with him almost constantly, a grim symbol of their precarious situation. Sarah's pregnancy was advancing rapidly. She was often tired, her back ached, and the baby's movements were strong and insistent. The thought of bringing a child into such a dangerous, uncertain world filled her with a deep, gnawing fear. But it also fueled her determination. She would not let Blackwood destroy the fragile hope they had managed to cultivate. One afternoon, as Sarah was resting inside the cabin, trying to escape the oppressive summer heat, she heard raised voices outside. Her heart leaped into her throat. She struggled to her feet and went to the window, peering out cautiously. It was Silas Blackwood himself. He was a large, imposing man with a florid face and eyes like cold steel, mounted on a fine black stallion. Cletus and two other rough-looking men were with him. Jedediah stood before them, unarmed this time, having been caught tending the garden. Lily was clinging to his leg, her face buried in his trousers. Thorn, Blackwood's voice boomed, arrogant and dismissive. I see you're still playing house. Goo. But playtime's over. I've come to collect what's mine. I owe you nothing, Blackwood, Jedediah said, his voice steady despite the overwhelming odds. You know that debt was a lie. Blackwood chuckled, a humorless, cruel sound. A lie? It's on paper, Thorn. Signed and witnessed by my own honest men. He gestured to Cletus and the others, who smirked. And you, my friend, are the collateral. I had you sold once to cover part of it. Seems that sale wasn't quite permanent. His eyes flicked towards the cabin, a predatory gleam in them. I hear you got yourself a wife now. Maybe she can persuade you to be reasonable. Or maybe she has other assets I could claim. Sarah felt a surge of cold fury. This man was despicable. She couldn't let Jedediah face him alone. Gathering all her courage, she pushed open the cabin door and stepped outside, positioning herself slightly in front of Jedediah. Her pregnancy was prominent, undeniable. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. "Jedediah Thorne is my husband. He is not your property to claim. Whatever business you had with him before, it does not concern this household now." Blackwood's eyes narrowed, taking in Sarah from head to toe. Well, the little pregnant bird has claws. Does she? Your husband, you say? I have a bill of sale that says he belongs to me, little lady. And frontier law tends to respect a bill of sale. That bill of sale was based on a fraudulent debt. Sarah retorted, her voice rising. You coerced him, threatened him. That makes any document you hold invalid. Brave words, Mrs. Thorne, Blackwood sneered. But words won't stop me from taking what's mine. Cletus, fetch him. Cletus started to dismount, a cruel grin on his face. Jedediah pushed Sarah gently behind him. Stay back, Sarah. This ain't your fight. It is my fight, Jed, she cried, her hand gripping his arm. He's threatening our family. Just as Cletus took a step forward, another voice cut through the tense air. Hold it right there, Blackwood. All heads turned. Sheriff Brody, flanked by 2 armed deputies he must have hastily assembled, rode into the clearing. Mr. Henderson, looking grim and determined, was with them, carrying a shotgun. Blackwood looked momentarily surprised. Then his face hardened into a scowl. Brody, what's the meaning of this? This is a private matter. Doesn't look too private to me. Blackwood, Brody said, his eyes sweeping over the scene. Blackwood and his armed men, Jedediah standing protectively before his pregnant wife and child. Looks like intimidation. And I got a sworn statement here from Mr. Henderson, witness to your man Cletus making threats against the Thornes a few days back. Henderson nodded grimly. Threats? Blackwood scoffed. I was merely discussing a lawful debt. A debt that Mr. Thorne disputes, Brody said. And a bill of sale from an auction that happened in my jurisdiction. An auction I'm now beginning to think might have had some irregularities surrounding its cause. He looked pointedly at Blackwood. Seems Mr. Thorne here has a wife now, a home. He's under my protection, as a citizen of this county. And so are his wife and child. This is outrageous. Blackwood blustered, his face turning a deeper shade of red. You're interfering in my lawful business. Your lawful business seems to involve terrorizing families. Blackwood, Brody said, his voice cold. And that's something I don't tolerate in my county. Now, I suggest you and your men move along. And don't come back here both Aaron the Thornes again. If you have a legitimate legal claim, you can file it with the circuit judge when he next comes through. But no more strong-arm tactics. Blackwood glared at Brody, then at Jedediah and Sarah, his eyes filled with venom. He knew he was outmaneuvered, at least for now. To challenge the sheriff openly, with witnesses present, would be foolish. This isn't over, Thorne, he snarled. And you, Brody, you'll regret poking your nose into my affairs. With a final, hateful look, Blackwood wheeled his horse around and, followed by his disgruntled men, rode away, disappearing back into the vastness of the prairie. A collective sigh of relief seemed to escape Sarah, Jedediah, and even Sheriff Brody. Sarah felt her knees tremble and leaned heavily against Jedediah, who put a steadying arm around her. Thank you, Sheriff, Jedediah said, his voice hoarse with emotion. Thank you, Mr. Henderson. Brody nodded, his weary face softening slightly. Just doing my job, Thorne. Though I confess. He glanced at Sarah, then back at Jedediah. Mrs. Thorne here seemed to be holding her own pretty well before we arrived. Takes guts to stand up to a man like Blackwood. He gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. Reckon Redemption Gulch might have misjudged a few folks. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat. Heard about Blackwood's man-making threats. Couldn't stand by and let that happen. Not after you two stood up in the church and made your vows. Seemed the right thing to do. To stand with you. Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes, tears of relief, of gratitude. They hadn't been completely alone after all. An unexpected ally in the form of the sheriff, prompted perhaps by a change of heart or a sense of duty, and the quiet support of Mr. Henderson, had made all the difference. As Sheriff Brody and his deputies prepared to leave, Brody paused. This might not be the absolute end of it with Blackwood, he warned. He's a snake, but he knows now that you ain't alone, and that the law here will stand for you. That ought to count for something. He tipped his hat. Good day, Mrs. Thorne. Thorne, keep that little one safe. He glanced at Lily, who was now peeking out from behind Jedediah, her fear slowly receding. When they were finally alone, Sarah turned to Jedediah, her heart overflowing. We did it, Jed, she whispered. We faced him, and we're still standing. Jedediah pulled her into a rough, heartfelt embrace, his arms strong and reassuring around her. You were incredible, Sarah, he said, his voice thick with emotion, his one good eye shining. You stood up to him like a lioness protecting her cub. I ain't never seen anything braver. She leaned against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart, a rhythm that was becoming increasingly familiar, increasingly precious. In that moment, surrounded by the quiet hum of the prairie, the small, rough cabin felt like the safest place on earth. Their marriage, born of necessity and fear, had been tested by a formidable enemy, and in facing that test together, something profound had shifted between them. The carefully constructed walls of reserve and practicality had begun to crumble, revealing a foundation of mutual respect, courage, and a deepening, unspoken affection. The frontier had indeed been stunned, not just by a pregnant woman buying a one-eyed cowboy and his daughter, but by the extraordinary resilience of the family they were becoming. The confrontation with Silas Blackwood marked a significant turning point. While the threat from him might linger distantly, his immediate power over them was broken. More importantly, the incident and Sheriff Brody's public defense of the Thorns began to shift perceptions within Redemption Gulch. People had witnessed Sarah's courage and Jedediah's quiet fortitude. They had seen the sheriff, the embodiment of law and order, stand firmly on their side. Even Mrs. Higgins found her usual pronouncements falling on less receptive ears. It was hard to paint the Thorns as immoral or shameful when they had faced down a known bully with dignity and had the law's backing. A fragile peace settled over the small homestead. Jedediah worked their land with renewed vigor, the lines of worry on his face slowly softening. Sarah, her time drawing near, focused on preparing for the baby, her earlier anxieties tempered by a newfound sense of security and Jedediah's unwavering support. Lily, no longer shadowed by constant fear, chattered and played with a child's carefree joy, her laughter echoing around the cabin. The bond between Sarah and Jedediah deepened in the quiet days that followed. The pretense of their marriage being solely one of convenience began to feel increasingly thin. The shared danger had forged a connection that went beyond mere practicality. There were looks that lingered, accidental touches that sent a jolt of awareness through them both, silences filled with unspoken understanding. The single bed in the cabin remained Sarah's, and Jedediah still slept on his blanket by the stove, but the space between them felt charged with a new, tender emotion. One cool evening, as the first stars began to prick the darkening sky, Sarah sat on the small porch, her hands resting on her swollen belly. Jedediah sat beside her, whittling a small wooden bird for Lily. The silence between them was comfortable, companionable. "The baby will be here soon," Sarah said softly, more to herself than to him. Jedediah's hands stilled. He looked at her, his one blue eye gentle. "Are you scared, Sarah?" She nodded. "A little. It's all so unknown." He reached out, his calloused fingers briefly, hesitantly, covering hers where they rested on her belly. The touch was warm, reassuring. "You won't be alone," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I'll be here. We'll face it together, just like we faced Blackwood." His words, simple and direct, filled her with a profound sense of comfort. "We'll face it together." It was the promise of partnership, of shared burdens, of a future intertwined. She looked at him, at his strong, weathered face, the kindness in his eye, and realized with a startling clarity that her feelings for this man, this one-eyed cowboy she had bought at auction, ran far deeper than gratitude or respect. It was a quiet, steady love, born of shared hardship and mutual admiration. A few weeks later, under a sky ablaze with a prairie sunset, Sarah's labor began. It was long and difficult, but Jedediah was true to his word. He was there, a rock of steadfast support. He held her hand, wiped her brow, spoke words of encouragement in his low, calming voice. His presence was a source of strength she hadn't known she possessed. And when their son was finally born, a healthy, lusty-lunged infant with a shock of dark hair, it was Jedediah who gently cleaned him and wrapped him in the soft blanket Sarah had sewn, his one good eye shining with an emotion that mirrored the overwhelming love and awe in Sarah's own heart. He laid the baby in her arms, and as Sarah looked down at her son, then up at Jedediah, who stood watching them, his face tender, she knew that their unconventional family was now complete. Lily, awakened by the commotion, tiptoed in, her eyes wide with wonder as she peeked at her new baby brother. "He's beautiful, Sarah," Jedediah whispered, his voice thick. "Our son," Sarah corrected softly, her gaze meeting his, and in that shared look all pretenses fell away. This was not a marriage of convenience anymore. This was real. This was a family, forged in the crucible of the frontier, bound by courage, compassion, and a love that had defied all expectations. Word of the baby's birth spread through Redemption Gulch. And this time the reaction was different. There was less gossip, more quiet curiosity, even a few tentative offers of help. Mrs. Henderson, the storekeeper's wife, brought over a freshly baked loaf of bread and a small knitted cap for the baby. Even Mrs. Higgins, encountering Sarah a few weeks later when she ventured into town with the baby, could only manage a somewhat grudging, "Well, he looks healthy enough. I suppose the frontier had indeed been stunned, not by scandal, but by the quiet triumph of an unlikely family who had found their own definition of happiness and belonging against all odds." One evening, as Sarah nursed her son, Daniel, by the warm glow of the fire, Jedediah sat across from her, watching, a soft smile playing on his lips. Lily was asleep on her cot, the small wooden bird he had carved for her clutched in her hand. The cabin was filled with a sense of peace, of contentment, so profound it was almost tangible. Jedediah reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. He crossed the room and knelt beside Sarah, gently taking her free hand. He opened his palm. Lying there was a simple, narrow gold band, thin from wear but still gleaming in the firelight. "It was my mother's," he said softly, his voice husky. "She gave it to me for my wife when the time came. I never had the chance to give it to Lily's mother." His gaze flickered with a momentary sadness, then returned to Sarah, earnest and full of a deep, abiding affection. "It ain't much, Sarah, but I want you to have it, if you'll wear it, as my wife, my real wife." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. She nodded, unable to speak. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. He looked at her then, at their son cradled in her arms, at the small, sturdy cabin that had become their home, and he knew a peace he had never thought to find again. He had been a broken man, sold at auction, but this brave, compassionate woman had seen something in him worth saving. She had bought him and his daughter not as property, but as people deserving of a chance. And in doing so, she had given him back his dignity, his hope, and his heart. What had stunned the frontier was not the unconventional purchase, but the profound, unexpected, and utterly transformative power of love and acceptance found in the most unlikely of circumstances. He watched her hum softly to their sleeping son, the firelight casting a warm glow on her face, and knew he was finally home. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion overcoming prejudice and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more.